There is a kind of phone call that arrives and tells you, before you even answer it, that your life is about to split into a before and an after. Mine came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the shape of 29 missed calls from a number in Illinois. I did not recognize the digits, but somewhere underneath my ribs, I already knew. My coffee went cold in my hand while I just sat there staring at the screen, because some part of me had been waiting 20 years for a call like this one, even while pretending I wasn't. I want to tell you what it feels like when a memory you buried on purpose claws its way back to the surface in a single moment. It does not creep up slowly. It slams into you. 1 second, I was a 32-year-old graphic designer standing in my kitchen in Denver, and the next, I was 12 years old again, standing alone under the ceiling of a train station in Chicago, watching two adults who were supposed to love me treat my terror like a punchline. My own mother left me at that station as a joke. My own father drove the getaway car. And somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, they turned my fear into a bet, an actual wager on whether a frightened child could find her own way home. I never went back to them after that day. Not that night. Not the following week. Not once in the 2 decades after. I rebuilt myself from nothing, changed my name, moved states away, and got so good at outrunning my own history that most mornings I could almost convince myself none of it had happened. I had a husband who loved me steadily, a business I had built with my own hands, a rescue dog who slept against my feet, and a version of peace I had fought hard to earn. But that morning, 29 missed calls proved something I had spent 20 years refusing to believe. The past does not always stay buried just because you walk far enough away from it. Sometimes, when you least expect it, it comes looking for you again. And this time, it was bringing news that would force me to decide, once and for all, what I actually owed the two people who once watched me from a moving car and laughed. Watching from where? Please comment. My name is Claire Whitman, and this is the story of the day my childhood finally caught up with me, and the day I learned exactly what I was willing to give the people who broke me. Growing up in Willow Creek, Illinois, taught me early that in my family, appearances were everything. To the neighbors, we looked like the picture of a solid, respectable household, the kind of family people pointed to when they wanted an example of hard work and good values. My parents ran a small chain of home goods stores, the sort of shops that sold kitchen mixers, bedding, discount coffee makers, and all the little household things people never realized they needed until they saw them on a shelf. On weekends, my father manned the grill in the backyard, my mother waved at people over the fence, and everyone around us assumed we were exactly what we appeared to be. Inside the house, though, love was never free. It was something you earned through performance, and safety depended entirely on whether my mother was bored enough to invent another lesson. That word was her favorite. If I cried, I was too sensitive. If I asked for help, I was helpless. If I forgot something, I clearly needed to learn responsibility. Any ordinary childhood mistake became, in her hands, a reason to humiliate me, and my father backed her up every time with a grin, as if cruelty were some kind of game the two of them enjoyed playing together. When I was 8, I asked for new sneakers because mine were falling apart at the toes. My mother accused me of acting spoiled, marched me to a bench near the food court at the mall, and told me that if I wanted to survive in the real world, I could start by sitting there alone and learning that nobody owed me anything. They left me on that bench for almost 3 hours. I remember staring at the pretzel stand, breathing in the smell of cinnamon and butter, trying not to cry because crying only seemed to entertain them. When they finally returned, my father laughed and asked my mother if she owed him $20, since he'd bet I would still be sitting in that exact spot. When I was 10, I cried after a youth football game because some boys from school had mocked me in the parking lot. Instead of comforting me, my parents drove to the far end of the stadium lot, told me to get out, and left me there after dark, because according to my mother, tears made a person weak, and weakness only invited worse treatment. I sat on a curb hugging my knees, watching truck after truck pull away, until they finally came back nearly an hour later with fast food for themselves and no apology for me. My father thought it was hilarious that I was still sitting there. He said he'd bet I would try to hitch a ride home or beg a stranger for help. That was the pattern of my whole childhood. Everything became a test. Everything became a joke at my expense. Everything became one more chance for them to prove how hard the world could be, as if I needed their help making it harder. The strangest part is that they never saw themselves as cruel. They talked about character and grit and preparing me for reality. They dressed up ugly behavior in noble-sounding words. If you had asked them, they would have told you they were raising an independent daughter. But what they were actually building in me wasn't independence. It was fear. It was hypervigilance. It was silence. I learned to read their moods before I ever opened my mouth. I learned how to disappear inside my own house. I learned that if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, small enough, maybe I could get through a day without being chosen for one of their experiments. The only place I ever felt like myself was on paper. I drew constantly, on the backs of receipts, in the margins of homework, on cheap sketch pads bought with babysitting money. I drew bedrooms with locked doors, train windows full of light, women standing alone on mountaintops with no one behind them. At 12, I couldn't have told you what any of that meant. Looking back now, I know I was trying to draw my way out of my own life. What finally pushed everything over the edge was something most parents wouldn't remember a week later. I brought home a B+ in art. Not math, not science. Art, the one class that made me feel like a real person. I was proud of it, right up until I walked through the front door and saw my mother holding my report card like it was proof of some moral failure. She asked how a girl who spent so much time drawing could still manage to disappoint her in the one subject she supposedly loved. My father said maybe I was getting lazy. My mother said maybe I'd decided effort alone was enough. That night, sitting in my room pretending to do homework, I heard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low and amused in a way that always made my stomach clench. My mother said I needed a lesson I would never forget. My father said he'd bet money on it. The next morning, they were unnervingly cheerful. My mother made pancakes. My father actually asked if I wanted orange juice. They announced we were taking a day trip into Chicago, just the three of us. For one foolish, hopeful second, I thought maybe they were trying to make up for the fight over my report card. Maybe this was the closest thing our family could manage to an apology. I should have known better. The whole drive from Willow Creek into the city felt wrong in a way I couldn't name at the time. My father kept the radio blasting and drummed on the steering wheel like he was in a fantastic mood. My mother kept twisting around from the front seat to ask me questions she already knew the answers to. Did I think I was smart? Did I think smart girls were ready for the real world? Did I think life cared whether I was scared? Every answer I gave seemed to amuse them. Every silence only made them push harder. By the time the skyline came into view, my body already knew something bad was coming, and that I wouldn't be given any warning before it did. We parked near Union Station a little before noon. I had never seen anything so enormous or so crowded. The station felt like an entire city folded under one roof. Travelers with rolling suitcases rushing in every direction. Businessmen, families, tourists, college students, all of them moving like they knew exactly where they belonged. I stayed close to my parents because I had no idea where else to stand. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed toward a large pillar near the entrance and told me to wait right there while they moved the car and picked up lunch. 15 minutes, she said. Maybe 20. I asked if I could come with them. My father laughed so loudly that people turned to look and told me I was 12, not 2. My mother leaned in close and warned me not to embarrass her in public, so I nodded, and I stayed by that pillar while they walked off. I remember checking the big station clock again and again. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. At first I told myself the parking must be bad, or the lunch line was long, or they'd gotten turned around somewhere. An hour in, my chest started to ache. An hour and a half in, panic rose so fast my hands began shaking. I had $9 in my pocket. No phone, no address written down anywhere, no idea how any of the trains worked. I had never felt so small in my entire life. I would drift a few feet from the pillar, then rush back, terrified of doing the wrong thing even in the middle of being abandoned. The station only grew louder as the afternoon dragged on. Every announcement over the speakers made my heart jump. Every dark-haired woman in the crowd made me spin around. Every minute stretched longer than the one before it. Then, through the front windows, I saw our car gliding slowly past on the street outside. My whole body flooded with relief so powerful, I nearly laughed out loud. I ran toward the glass, waving both arms, certain for one glorious second that they had come back for me. My father was driving. My mother sat in the passenger seat. Both of them were looking directly at me. My father smiled first. Not the relieved smile of a parent who'd found a lost child, but the smile of a man watching his own punchline land exactly the way he'd hoped. My mother rolled her window down just enough to be heard over the traffic and called out, "I bet $50 you can't even find your way home." Then she laughed. My father laughed right along with her, lifting one hand off the wheel in a stupid little thumbs up, as if they were congratulating each other on a job well done. Then the car pulled away and vanished into traffic. That was the moment my entire world changed shape. It's one thing to fear that your parents might forget about you. It's another thing entirely to watch them choose it, to see them enjoying it, to understand all at once that my fear wasn't some unfortunate side effect of their lesson. It was the whole point of it. I stood frozen until a stranger brushed past and muttered, "Excuse me," and the sound of an unfamiliar voice finally snapped me back into my own body. I ran back inside because I had no idea what else to do. I wandered from one end of the station to the other, crying on and off, wiping my face every few minutes because even then I was ashamed to be seen upset. That, too, was something they had trained into me. I tried to think of anyone I could call, but there was no one. I tried to picture the route home, and it might as well have been another country. I sat down on a bench, stood up again, walked in slow circles until my legs ached. At some point, I stopped expecting them to come back at all. At some point, waiting quietly turned into simply being abandoned. That difference sounds small when you say it out loud, but at 12 years old, it feels like the ice cracking under your feet. I spent close to 3 hours inside that station after they drove off. Long enough for the light outside to shift, long enough for the crowds to thin out and then swell again, long enough that I stopped thinking in full sentences and started running purely on instinct. I avoided the doors because I was terrified of stepping out into the city and getting even more lost. I avoided the police because my parents had always warned me that causing trouble would only make things worse. I avoided strangers because the very people who'd just abandoned me had spent years teaching me that asking for help was a weakness. Looking back, that might be the cruelest part of what they did. They trained me not to trust anyone and then left me somewhere that trust was the only thing that could save me. The person who finally noticed me was a station employee named Carol. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and a calm voice that made you want to tell the truth even when you were frightened. She had apparently watched me pass the same row of seats and vending machines several times over. She stopped me near a hallway leading toward the administrative offices and asked if I was lost. I lied right away and said I was waiting for my parents. She asked how long I'd been waiting. I said I didn't know. Then she asked if I'd eaten anything, and that question was the one that broke me completely. I started crying so hard I could barely catch my breath. Every bit of shame I'd been carrying since noon came pouring out all at once. I told her they had left me. I told her they'd driven past the station and laughed. I told her my mother had made a bet on whether I could find my way home. Carol didn't react the way my parents would have. She didn't tell me to calm down or accuse me of being dramatic. She crouched down until her face was level with mine and said, very clearly, "You're safe right now, and I'm going to help you." Security was called first, then transit police. One officer took my statement, while another pulled up the footage from the cameras covering the front entrance. They confirmed I had been standing there for hours, and that a car matching my description had slowed near the curb outside before driving off again. That detail mattered later. At the time, all I understood was that the adults around me had suddenly turned very serious. One officer asked for my parents' names, our home address, the name of our store, anything I could remember. Another brought me water and crackers, since I hadn't eaten since breakfast. When they finally reached my parents by phone, I could only hear half of the conversation. But I will never forget the officer's face. It shifted from cautious professionalism to open disbelief in about 10 seconds. He asked if they were heading back to Chicago immediately. Then he went quiet for a long moment, listened, and said, "No, ma'am. Leaving a 12-year-old alone in a major transit station is not a lesson in independence. It's child abandonment." My whole body went cold hearing those words. not because they sounded too harsh, but because they finally fit. By early evening, I was sitting in a small interview room with a social worker while paperwork was drawn up. She explained that since my parents were refusing to come back immediately and were still insisting this had been a legitimate parenting choice, I couldn't simply be sent home with them, even if they changed their minds later. There would be an emergency placement while family court reviewed the case. I didn't understand most of the legal terms, but I understood the look on her face. She believed me. More than that, she believed I hadn't been safe long before that particular afternoon. I was terrified when they told me I'd be spending the night with a foster family. I'd grown up hearing stories about what happened to kids who were taken away. Then I met Tom and Diane Whitman. They weren't glamorous, and they weren't trying too hard to seem perfect. He was a photographer with ink stains permanently on his fingers from handling prints. She was a preschool teacher who smelled faintly of lotion and classroom paper. Their house was warm and a little cluttered in the way a place feels when it's actually lived in rather than staged. There was a lamp lit in the entryway, framed family photos on the wall, and a dog bed in the corner, even though the dog itself was asleep somewhere in the back. Diane asked if I wanted spaghetti or soup. Tom asked whether I liked the hallway light on or off at night. Nobody yelled when I said I didn't know. Nobody teased me for crying at the dinner table after 2 bites, too exhausted to keep pretending I was fine. That first night in their guest room, I barely slept. Every car door outside made me flinch. Every creak in the hallway made me sit straight up. But even through all of that fear, one thought kept circling back. A stranger inside a train station had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than my own mother had shown me in years. I didn't have words for that yet. I only knew the world suddenly looked different. And once you see that other people are capable of protecting you, it becomes impossible to keep pretending cruelty is normal. The weeks that followed felt like living inside someone else's life. I went from the Whitman's house to meetings with social workers, to therapy evaluations, to a family court building downtown where adults spoke in careful, measured voices about my future, as though it were both fragile and urgent at once. My parents showed up with a lawyer and the exact same attitude they'd always worn at home: calm, offended, faintly amused that anyone was taking this so seriously. My mother wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, as though looking respectable could undo what she had done. My father sat back in his chair with his arms crossed, like the whole proceeding was simply an inconvenience he intended to outlast. They didn't deny leaving me at Union Station. That was the part I still can't quite get over. They admitted it outright. They just insisted it had been controlled, educational, necessary. My mother said they were building resilience in me. My father said kids today had gotten too soft, and somebody needed to teach me how the real world worked. Sitting across from them, listening to this, I understood something that changed me almost as much as the train station itself had. They were never going to become the kind of parents capable of real honesty. If they had been, they would have turned that car around before it ever reached the freeway. The court-appointed therapist's report described a clear pattern of emotional abuse, humiliation, neglect, and escalating endangerment. Those weren't my words, but hearing them spoken out loud felt like air rushing into a room that had been sealed shut for years. I had spent so long believing my childhood was somehow my own fault, because that was easier than accepting that the adults responsible for me had chosen to cause harm on purpose. The report made it unmistakable. This hadn't been a misunderstanding or a strict parenting style. It had been abuse, simply dressed up in respectable language. When the judge finally asked whether I wanted to go home while the court monitored my family, I said no so quickly it surprised even me. My mother looked at me as if I had slapped her. My father muttered something under his breath about ingratitude. The judge didn't flinch. The plan afterward was supposed to move toward reunification. Parenting classes, family therapy, supervised visits, ongoing reviews, a long process meant to give my parents a real chance to prove they could change. On paper, it sounded fair. In reality, my parents treated the whole thing like a personal insult. They despised being evaluated. They despised being supervised. They despised the fact that teachers, therapists, and court officials now had a window into the private version of our family they had spent years hiding behind a polished front. My father complained more about the damage to the store's reputation than he ever did about losing custody of me. My mother kept insisting she wouldn't let the state tell her how to raise her own child. Then, at the most critical point in the entire case, they were given a choice. They could commit to a 2-year reunification program and fully comply with everything the court required, or they could voluntarily give up their parental rights. They chose to give me up. My chest didn't shatter in that courtroom the way you might expect. It went strangely still. I had spent my whole life trying to be good enough to keep them from turning on me, and in the end, they surrendered me rather than admit they had been wrong. That was the truth that stayed with me the longest. I didn't lose them because the system took me away. They handed me over to protect their pride. After that, everything moved faster. The Whitmans were already licensed foster parents, and over the following months, they became something far more than that. Tom began saving old photography magazines and art books for me once he noticed how much I drew. Diane started knocking before she entered my room, which sounds like such a small thing until you've grown up in a house with no concept of privacy at all. They learned which foods made me anxious because of old punishments tied to dinner. They stopped expecting eye contact from me whenever I was upset. They never demanded love or gratitude or instant trust. They simply stayed. To a child who has never known steadiness, steadiness can feel almost impossible to believe. The adoption became official once enough time had passed for the process to run its course, but emotionally, it had already happened long before any judge signed a single paper. When they asked whether I wanted to change my name, I didn't hesitate. Emily Carter belonged to a girl who had once stood in a train station with $9 in her pocket, unsure whether she'd still have a family by the end of the day. Claire Whitman belonged to somebody else entirely, someone with a room of her own, a desk covered in art supplies, a family who never laughed when she was afraid. I still remember the first night after the adoption was final. Diane put fresh sheets on my bed the way she always did on Sundays. Tom left a brand new sketchbook on my desk, and nobody made a speech about how grateful I should feel. They simply acted as though I had always been theirs. That quiet certainty healed something in me that no dramatic gesture ever could have. It taught me that real love doesn't test you to see if you've earned it. Real love makes space for you before you even know how to relax into it. Healing didn't happen all at once, and it certainly didn't happen in a straight line. People love stories where a single act of rescue fixes everything, where the wounded child instantly blossoms the moment she's placed somewhere safe. My life wasn't like that. For years afterward, my body still reacted to kindness as though it might be a trap. If Diane said she'd be back from the store in 15 minutes, I had to fight the urge to stand at the window until her car returned. If Tom was running late picking me up from an after-school event because of traffic, panic would build in me so fast my hands would go numb. I hated waiting anywhere in public. I hated being told to stay put. I hated the phrase, "I'll be right back." Therapy helped, but it was slow, grinding work, the kind that makes you say ugly truths out loud again and again until your nervous system finally starts to believe what your mind already knows. I learned words like trauma and emotional abuse and hypervigilance. I learned that being hurt over and over doesn't make a person stronger in the way cruel people love to claim. It makes you extraordinarily good at surviving, and it makes it nearly impossible to rest. Through all of it, the Whitmans never rushed me. They showed up to school events, helped with homework, remembered exactly which topics could set me off, and let me keep my bedroom door shut whenever I needed space. They never tried to erase what had happened to me. They simply helped me build a life where it was no longer the only thing that defined me. Art became more than an escape. It became structure, language, proof that I could create something beautiful entirely on my own terms. I poured myself into it through high school, then through college applications, then through every portfolio review and late-night studio session after I was accepted into the Art Institute of Chicago. Moving back toward the city that had once terrified me wasn't some symbolic gesture at first. It was simply practical. The program was strong, and it was right for me. But somewhere in the middle of those years, I realized I was quietly reclaiming something. The same city where I had once been abandoned became the place where I built myself back up. I studied graphic design, worked part-time, kept going to therapy, and slowly learned how to exist around people who didn't require me to make myself smaller. After graduation, I took a job in Denver with a branding firm that focused on identity work for small businesses, and for the very first time in my life, I lived far enough from Illinois that geography itself felt like it was finally on my side. Denver gave me room to breathe. New streets, new routines, dry mountain air that seemed to clear my head. Eventually, I started taking on freelance clients, then opened my own studio. I built a reputation for clean, honest visual storytelling, the kind of work that helps people say plainly who they are and what they stand for. Some days the irony of that isn't lost on me. My entire career grew out of having spent a childhood trapped inside somebody else's lies. I met Ryan through a friend at a housewarming party. He was a software engineer, patient in a way that never felt performed, and remarkably hard to rattle. On our third date, I mentioned that I had a complicated family history. On our fifth, I told him a little more. Months later, when I finally told him the full story of Union Station, he didn't interrupt, didn't overreact, didn't offer some hollow line about everything happening for a reason. He just reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "That should never have happened to you." The simplicity of it nearly undid me completely. We built our life together the same careful way I had rebuilt myself, slowly, deliberately, with room for total honesty. We married in a small ceremony, with Tom walking me down the aisle and Diane fixing the back of my dress while trying not to cry. We adopted a rescue dog we named Buddy, a mutt with one torn ear, and the cautious soul of a creature who had also been left behind too soon. I blocked every account my biological parents had ever tried to use to reach me. Social media, old email addresses, everything. I even changed my phone number once, after a holiday voicemail from an Illinois number left me shaking for an hour straight. I didn't talk about them unless I absolutely had to. I never went back to Willow Creek. I never used my old name. Most weeks, I could go entire stretches of time without thinking about Emily Carter at all. That was the life I had built by the time those 29 missed calls came through. A good marriage, a studio full of steady clients, morning walks with Buddy, dinners with friends, Sunday phone calls with Tom and Diane. A life so quiet and whole that I sometimes wondered if peace always felt this strange to people who hadn't spent their childhood fighting for it. Then my phone lit up with 29 missed calls from Illinois, and the ground under all that peace shifted. There was a voicemail, then an email from an address I didn't recognize, then a message request on LinkedIn, the one platform I'd kept public because of work. That last detail was what told me this had taken real effort. Someone had been searching. Someone had finally connected Claire Whitman back to the girl they had once laughed at through a car window. I sat at my kitchen counter with the phone in my hand while Buddy pressed against my leg, and Ryan watched the color drain from my face. I had spent 20 years making absolutely sure the past stayed buried. Whatever was happening now had dug it up with both hands. The voicemail wasn't from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Megan. I hadn't heard her voice since she was a little girl trailing behind me through the hallway in mismatched socks, too young to understand why the air in our house always felt charged. Her voice sounded older now, rougher, the way a voice sounds when life has pressed down hard on it. She said our mother had late-stage cancer. She said our father had suffered a mild stroke 6 months earlier. She said the stores were gone, not struggling, gone, closed or sold off at a loss after the story I thought had been buried in old court records resurfaced in the worst possible way. A relative had posted about the Union Station incident in a local Facebook group after my mother, in a stunning act of hypocrisy, left a comment on someone else's parenting post about how children today needed stronger discipline. That single comment cracked the door open. Old neighbors started talking. A retired court clerk who probably should have kept quiet hinted that the old rumors were true. Someone dug up an old newspaper brief about a custody case tied to a minor abandonment investigation. A former store employee added their own account of what my parents were really like behind closed doors. The image they had spent decades polishing collapsed in public, fast and ugly. Customers stopped coming. People started driving to bigger stores in the next town rather than hand over another dollar. Church friends went quiet. Civic groups stopped calling. Willow Creek, the same town that had once protected them with gossip and politeness, turned on them using those exact same tools. Megan said they were living in a subsidized apartment outside town now. No house, no stores, No standing left, no version of the old family left to hide behind. Then she said the line that finally explained why there had been 29 missed calls instead of one respectful message. They wanted me to come back, not because they had suddenly become different people, not because time had made them brave enough to face what they'd done, but because they had run out of options and they were terrified of dying alone. I asked Megan why she was calling at all, given every reason I had never to answer. There was a long pause, and then she said, "Because I wanted you to hear it from someone who isn't lying to you." She told me she had cut contact too, not years ago, but recently, after becoming a mother herself and finally requesting copies of the old court paperwork to understand what had really happened the day I disappeared from the family. Our parents had spent years feeding her a watered-down version of events, that I had overreacted, that the state had overstepped, that I'd been manipulated by foster parents who simply wanted a daughter of their own. Megan said reading the actual records felt like being hit by a truck. She looked at her own little boy afterward and understood she could never let people like that anywhere near him. Hearing all of that should have felt like a triumph. Instead, it left me tired in a place deeper than anger. She asked if I would come. I told her I'd think about it. Ryan told me I owed them nothing. Diane told me that whatever I decided, it had to be for my own peace, not their comfort. Tom said quietly that some people only come looking for the bridge after they've already burned the house down. I sat with all of that through the night. By morning, one thing was completely clear to me. I wasn't going back to save them. I was going back to end it, in my own voice, on my own terms. I flew into Chicago 2 days later and drove the rest of the way to the hospital where my mother was being treated. The room smelled like disinfectant and old fear. My father looked older than I had pictured him, smaller too, as though illness and disgrace had finally stripped away the performance and left just an ordinary man underneath. My mother still wore that carefully arranged expression, even half sick, as though dignity were something she could simply put on like lipstick. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother started crying before I had even sat down. Not a quiet cry, but the kind built to pull focus. She said my name. My old one. I corrected her once, and only once. "Claire." She nodded, dabbing at her face, and my father said they had made mistakes. Mistakes. The same cowardly word people reach for when the truth is too ugly to say plainly. I told them no. A mistake is missing an exit. A mistake is forgetting the milk at the store. What they did was deliberate. They left a 12-year-old girl alone in a train station, in a city she didn't know, laughed while she panicked, and then spent 20 years lying about it to protect themselves. My father started to speak, probably to explain himself, but I hadn't traveled all that way to sit through another defense dressed up in gentler words. I told them they had turned my fear into a game, and the reason they were sitting there now, without a business, without respect, without either of their daughters beside them, was because games eventually end. People find out, children grow up, the truth catches up, even in small towns that believe silence can bury anything forever. My mother asked if I could forgive them. I told her forgiveness wasn't a debt I owed to people who only came looking for me once their own lives fell apart. I said the sentence I had been carrying in one form or another since I was 12 years old. You bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just never came back to yours. They both cried after that, but for once, their tears didn't move me at all. I wasn't cruel. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. That, more than anything, surprised me. When the reckoning finally came, it didn't feel loud. It felt cold, clear, and exact. I told them I would not be paying their medical bills, managing their care, or restoring any kind of contact. I told them Megan had every right to protect her own son from them. I told them my family lived in Colorado and in Illinois with the people who had actually earned that title. Then I stood up. My father asked if this was really goodbye. I looked at him and said it had already been goodbye for 20 years. He was simply the last one to understand that. I walked out after about 20 minutes and never looked back. In the parking lot, the air felt thin and unusually bright. I stood there with my hands trembling, not from regret, but from that strange release that comes when something that has haunted you for years finally takes a shape you're able to set down and walk away from. On the flight home, I thought about that little girl standing alone in Union Station, the one who had believed being abandoned meant being unwanted forever. She had been wrong. She was unwanted by two broken people who confused cruelty with strength, but she was never unworthy of love. There is a real difference between those two things, and learning it is what saved my life. If there's a lesson anywhere in what happened to me, it's this. Abuse doesn't become discipline just because a parent dresses it up in cleaner words. Humiliation doesn't build character. Fear doesn't make children stronger. It only makes them grow old before their time. And walking away from people who hurt you, even people who share your blood, isn't bitterness. Sometimes it's the healthiest choice you will ever make. I didn't leave that hospital feeling guilty. I left feeling educated by my own survival. The family you're born into can shape your wounds, but it doesn't get to decide your future. Real love doesn't laugh when you're scared. Real family doesn't test whether you can survive without them. And real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and finally start calling it what it actually was. Once you do that, you can build a life so honest, so steady, and so full of peace that not even the people who broke you can ever take it back.